Zekthor had been doing his job for 300 cycles, and he thought he had seen everything the galaxy could offer when it came to war and fighting and all the ways different species tried to kill each other. But he was about to learn that. He knew nothing at all about what real combat looked like when humans were involved, and that thought would haunt him for the rest of his very long life. Because some things once seen cannot be unseen, and some truths once learned cannot be unlearned, no matter how hard you try to forget them. The assignment came through the normal channels like it always did, and there was nothing special about it that caught his attention at first, because it seemed routine and boring, like most observation missions turned out to be in the end. And Zekthor almost declined it because he was tired and wanted a break from watching species blow each other up in space. But his sense of duty won out like it always did, and he accepted the mission to observe these newcomers called humans who had just joined the Galactic Coalition and were about to face combat for the first time against some raiders in the outer regions of known space. He arrived at the human ship called Defiant, and his first impression was not good because the vessel looked old and crude compared to what other species used for war, and the metal hull was just basic alloy instead of the fancy adaptive materials that most civilized worlds preferred, and the weapons were simple kinetic guns that threw chunks of metal instead of elegant energy beams that could slice through shields like butter. And even the engines looked primitive because they worked by setting off controlled explosions instead of using clean antimatter reactors or quantum drives. And Zekthor made notes about all of this in his report, with a feeling of disappointment, because he had hoped humans would be more interesting than this. Captain Jacob Hayes met him in the landing bay, and he was a tall human with lines on his face that spoke of years spent in dangerous places doing dangerous things, and his eyes were sharp and calculating like he was always thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else, and he greeted Zekthor with polite words. But there was something in his voice that the observer could not quite identify, and it made him uncomfortable in a way he did not fully understand yet, but would soon learn to recognize as the sound of someone who had seen terrible things and survived them and was prepared to see more. Hayes explained that Zekthor would be shadowed by Lieutenant Commander Lisa Grant during the mission, and she would make sure he stayed safe during any combat situations, and Hayes said this with a slight smile that did not reach his eyes, and then he added a warning that human warfare was different from what the observer was probably used to seeing. And Zekthor felt his mandibles click in amusement because he had heard similar claims from dozens of species over his long career, and every single one of them had been wrong because war was war, no matter who was fighting it, and there were only so many ways to destroy an enemy ship in the vast emptiness of space. Lisa Grant turned out to be a compact woman with sharp features and the same hard look in her eyes that Hayes had, and she showed Zekthor around the ship, pointing out the various systems and stations and crew quarters, and everything looked worn and used and practical without any of the polish or elegance that marked the ships of more advanced civilizations, and the crew members they passed all looked tired but alert, and they moved with purpose through the narrow corridors like they had done this 1,000 times before and knew exactly what needed to be done without anyone telling them. The observer asked how many crew served on the Defiant, and Lisa told him there were 243 people, which seemed like too few for a ship this size, but she just shrugged and said they made it work somehow, and Zekthor made another note about human inefficiency and poor resource management, because any other species would have automated half these positions or used better crew rotation schedules. But humans apparently preferred to do things the hard way for reasons he could not begin to understand. When they reached the bridge, Zekthor saw it was a cramped space filled with stations and screens and crew members hunched over their consoles working with intense focus, and the whole room hummed with quiet tension that you could feel in the air like electricity before a storm, and he set up his recording equipment at an observation station in the corner, where he would be out of the way but still able to document everything that happened during the coming battle. The sensor officer, whose name tag read Connor Price, suddenly announced that 8 Krathix raider vessels had been detected, and they were closing fast on an intercept course, and everyone on the bridge immediately shifted into higher alert without any panic or shouting. And Hayes settled into his command chair with the calm of someone sitting down to breakfast instead of preparing for a fight that might kill them all. And he gave orders in a steady voice to bring the ship to a new heading and load all weapons tubes. The Krathix were known across the galaxy as vicious raiders who had terrorized the Outer Rim territories for generations, and they used cybernetic implants to enhance their bodies, and their ships were fast and deadly, and their tactics were brutal and efficient, and most coalition species only engaged them with overwhelming numbers, or from very long range where the raiders could not close for their preferred knife-fighting style of combat. But the Defiant was alone and outnumbered, and Zekthor began to worry that he might not survive this observation mission after all. A communication came through from the Krathix commander, and his face on the view screen was a nightmare mixture of flesh and metal, grafted together in ways that looked painful, and he demanded that the human ship surrender immediately or be destroyed. And there was confidence in his mechanical voice because he knew he had superior numbers and superior position, and there was no logical way the humans could win this fight. Hayes listened to the demand, and then he leaned back in his chair and spoke with casual certainty that the Krathix were violating coalition space and should withdraw or face consequences, and the raider commander made a grinding sound that might have been laughter and pointed out that one primitive destroyer could not hope to defeat 8 warships, and Hayes agreed that the odds were not good. But then he said something that made Zekthor's blood run cold in his veins, and it was simply that the humans would make sure the raiders regretted every second of the coming fight. The transmission ended, and Hayes addressed his crew over the ship-wide channel and told them they could run or surrender. But they were not going to do either. And instead, they were going to remind the Krathix why humanity had earned its place. In the coalition and throughout the ship, a roar of approval echoed through the corridors, and Zekthor realized with growing horror that these humans were not afraid of the impossible odds. And in fact, they seemed almost eager for the fight, and that was when he understood that everything he thought he knew about warfare was about to be proven completely wrong. The first wave of fire from the Krathix raiders hammered into the Defiant's shields, and the whole ship shook, like it was being hit by a giant fist, and warning alarms began screaming from every console, and Zekthor gripped his observation station with all 4 of his arms because he was sure they were about to die. But Hayes just sat calmly in his command chair, asking for damage reports in the same tone you might use to ask about the weather, and the engineering officer named Danny Rogers reported that forward shields were down to 60%, but hull integrity was still holding. Hayes ordered all weapons to return fire, and the Defiant's railguns opened up with a sound like thunder that Zekthor could feel in his bones, and he watched on the tactical display as solid metal slugs flew through space at speeds that bent physics, and they punched straight through the Krathix shields like the shields were not even there, and tore massive holes in the armor plating of the nearest raider ship, which began spinning away, trailing atmosphere and debris. And Zekthor could not believe what he was seeing because Krathix shields were designed to disperse energy weapons, and they were supposed to be nearly impenetrable, but these primitive kinetic weapons just ignored the shields completely. The helm officer brought the ship hard to starboard on Hayes' order, and Zekthor heard Connor at the sensor station point out that this maneuver would put them in a worse tactical position. But Hayes just smiled in a way that was not comforting at all, and said that was only true if the enemy thought like a sensible person would think, and he told the helm to execute the turn immediately, and the Defiant dove toward the nearby gas giant, using its gravity and magnetic fields to disrupt the targeting systems of the pursuing raiders. 2 of the Krathix ships collided while trying to adjust their pursuit vectors, and their hulls crumpled together in a massive explosion that lit up the view screen, and a 3rd raider got too close to the gas giant's atmosphere and began to burn up in the upper layers, and Zekthor realized that Hayes had deliberately led them into a trap, using their own aggression against them, and the human captain had counted on the raiders being too focused on the attack to notice the danger until it was too late. Hayes gave another order, and dozens of missiles launched from the Defiant, but they were not flying toward the enemy ships, and instead, they detonated in carefully calculated positions around the battlefield, and each explosion released a massive electromagnetic pulse that washed over everything, and the Krathix vessels, which depended heavily on their cybernetic systems, suddenly went dark and dead in space, like someone had flipped a switch and turned them off. The humans opened fire with every weapon they had, and systematically tore apart the disabled raiders one by one, with ruthless efficiency, and there was no hesitation or mercy in how they worked, and within just a few minutes, 5 Krathix vessels had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris and frozen bodies, and Zekthor felt something cold settle in his chest, because he was watching a species that knew exactly how to kill and had no qualms about doing it when necessary. The 3 remaining raiders managed to reboot their systems and immediately turned to flee, and Hayes quietly ordered his crew not to let any of them escape, because if even one got away, it would warn the main Krathix fleet about human tactics. And the Defiant pursued at maximum speed, and Hayes ordered the spinal cannon to be prepared, and Zekthor's database told him this was a massive railgun that ran the entire length of the ship's spine and required all available power to fire and could only shoot in a straight line, but was apparently devastating when it hit. The lights across the entire ship dimmed as power was redirected to the spinal cannon, and then there was a sound like reality itself being torn apart, and a tungsten rod accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed crossed the distance to the fleeing raiders in less than a heartbeat, and struck the lead ship dead center, and the raider did not explode or break apart, but simply ceased to exist because the kinetic energy was so enormous that it vaporized the entire vessel instantly, and the expanding plasma wave caught the 2 ships behind it and destroyed them as well. Silence fell across the bridge like a heavy blanket, and Connor quietly reported that all threats had been eliminated, and there were no survivors detected anywhere in the debris field, and Hayes nodded and told everyone to stand down from battle stations and ordered damage control teams to begin repairs and asked medical for a casualty report. The chief medical officer reported 3 injured crew members and none of the injuries were critical, and Zekthor felt his mind struggling to process what had just happened because the humans had just destroyed an entire Krathix raiding party of 8 warships and only had 3 people with minor injuries, and it should have been impossible, but he had witnessed it with his own eyes, and his recording equipment had captured every moment. Lisa appeared at his side and asked if he was okay because he looked shaken, and Zekthor told her that human tactics made no logical sense and were dangerous and reckless and completely insane, but Lisa just shrugged and pointed out that the tactics had been effective, and that was what mattered, and Zekthor argued that they had used their ship as bait and flown into a gravity well during combat and disabled their own sensors with electromagnetic pulses, and any of those decisions could have resulted in their complete destruction. Lisa agreed that all of those things could have happened but pointed out that they did not happen. And Zekthor asked why humans would take such absurd risks, and the woman's expression grew cold and hard, and she explained that the alternative was letting raiders like the Krathix think they could threaten human ships without consequences, and she said that humans did not fight to survive but fought to win, and there was a big difference between those 2 things. Hayes came over and said he had overheard the conversation, and he told Zekthor that in human military history, there was a saying that the enemy gets a vote, and the Krathix had chosen to engage the Defiant, and had chosen to threaten his crew, and what happened after that was simply the logical outcome of their poor decision-making, and Zekthor repeated the word logical with disbelief, because there had been nothing logical about the entire engagement. Hayes asked if it was not logical to assess enemy tactics and identify their weaknesses and exploit them, and use terrain to their advantage and adapt weapons to counter defenses and eliminate threats with minimal casualties, and when he put it that way it did sound logical. But Zekthor argued that the risk was too great, and Hayes said that risk was inherent in warfare, and the question was not whether there was risk, but whether you were willing to accept it to achieve your objective, and the humans had been willing and the Krathix had not, and that was why they were having this conversation and the raiders were not. Zekthor realized he was trembling, because in all his centuries of observing warfare across the galaxy, he had never encountered a species quite like humans who did not fight with overwhelming force or superior technology, but instead fought with calculated aggression and tactical flexibility, and a disturbing willingness to gamble everything on a single decisive action, and it was absolutely terrifying to witness. Before anyone could say anything else, the alarms began blaring again, and Connor called out with a pale face that long-range sensors were detecting multiple jump signatures, and it was not more Krathix raiders but something much worse. And Hayes asked what they were facing, and Connor's voice shook slightly as he reported that it was the Krathix Fleet Command with 27 capital ships incoming fast, and they must have detected the distress signals before the Defiant destroyed the EU raiders. The bridge fell completely silent, and Zekthor felt ice run through his veins because 27 capital ships against 1 damaged destroyer was not a battle, but an execution, and there was no possible way to survive, and Hayes studied the tactical display for a long moment, and then he smiled, and Zekthor's fear doubled because that smile said the captain was about to do something even more insane than what had just happened, and Hayes spoke calmly and said they would just have to get creative. Every survival instinct in Zekthor's body screamed at him to demand immediate evacuation, because 27 Krathix capital ships represented enough firepower to turn a small planet into glass, and against a single destroyer, even one crewed. By insane humans, the outcome was mathematically certain and they were all going to die. But Hayes did not order retreat, and did not even look particularly concerned, which made Zekthor wonder if humans had some kind of brain defect that prevented them from understanding danger properly. Hayes asked how much time they had before contact, and Connor reported 18 minutes, and Hayes said that was more than enough time, which made no sense at all, and he ordered the helm to take them deeper into the gas giant's magnetosphere and told engineering to route every spare power cell to the shields, and Danny at engineering questioned this, because the radiation levels that deep would completely fry their external sensors, and Hayes agreed that was true but pointed out that the radiation would also fry Krathix sensors, and the difference was that the humans knew they were going in blind while the enemy would not expect it. Lisa stepped forward and pointed out that they could not possibly fight that many ships, and Hayes agreed completely and said they were not going to fight the fleet, but instead would make the Krathix fight each other. And Zekthor moved closer to the tactical display because Hayes gestured for him to come look, and the captain asked what he knew about Krathix command structure, and Zekthor was grateful for familiar ground and explained that they operated on a hierarchical system where each fleet was controlled by a primary command vessel, and secondary vessels coordinated fleet actions. Hayes nodded and asked if they used tight beam communications to prevent interception, and Zekthor confirmed this was correct, and Hayes pointed out that in a high radiation environment, their communication network would become unreliable and individual. Ships would have to make independent decisions, and that was when disciplined units fell apart, because they would second-guess orders and hesitate and make mistakes, and Connor interjected that their own communications would be just as disrupted. But Hayes said they did not need communications because everyone on the Defiant knew the plan, and had trained for chaos and could think on their feet, while the Krathix could not. The Defiant plunged deeper into the gas giant's outer atmosphere, and the hull groaned under stress, and outside the viewports massive storms raged with electrical discharges that lit up poisonous clouds in shades of green and purple and radiation. Warnings flashed across every console, and Connor reported external sensors were now offline, and Danny added that hull temperature was rising fast, and they had maybe 10 minutes before they needed to pull out, or the ship would start coming apart. Hayes said 10 minutes was plenty of time and ordered weapons to prepare everything they had, including mines and missiles, and every last railgun slug, and Lieutenant Kyle Foster at Weapons Control asked what the target was, and Hayes replied with one word, which was everything. And the crew moved with practiced efficiency in the dim emergency lighting, while the radiation outside created an eerie glow through the observation ports. Connor announced that the Krathix fleet was entering the magnetosphere, and they were spreading out in a search pattern, and Hayes said that was exactly what he had been counting on, and ordered the helm to bring them up slowly, and told Weapons that the moment they cleared the interference he wanted snapshot launches on the nearest targets, and explained they were not trying to destroy the enemy, but just create confusion, and Kyle confirmed he understood. The Defiant rose through the turbulent atmosphere like a sea monster emerging from dark water, and the moment they cleared the worst interference, the weapons launched, and missiles streaked in every direction, but not at the Krathix ships themselves, and instead at carefully calculated points around them, where they detonated, creating massive electromagnetic bursts that temporarily blinded sensors and disrupted communications across the entire enemy fleet. In the chaos, the Defiant fired railguns at 3 separate Krathix vessels, and the tungsten slugs punched through shields and armor before the raiders could respond, and then before the enemy could coordinate any kind of response, Hayes ordered the ship back down into the storm layers, where they disappeared from sensors again, and Kyle reported 3 hits confirmed, with 1 destroyer critically damaged and 2 cruisers suffering heavy damage to propulsion systems. Hayes explained that the enemy would think they were still in this area, and ordered Helm to take them to the opposite side of the planet, where they would hit the Krathix again from a completely different angle. And for the next 2 hours, the Defiant played a deadly game of hide-and-seek in the gas giant's atmosphere, where they would emerge and strike and vanish before the enemy could respond, and each attack was calculated to cause maximum confusion rather than maximum damage. Zekthor watched as the enemy fleet slowly began to unravel, because ships fired on sensor ghosts that were not really there, and others collided while trying to coordinate search patterns in the interference, and 3 vessels actually opened fire on each other when their identification systems failed in the radiation storm. And Lisa observed that the Krathiks were getting frustrated and starting to make mistakes, and Hayes said that was good, because now was the time to go for the command ship. Danny protested that they could not possibly take out a command ship because their shields alone were too strong, but Hayes said they did not need to destroy it, and only needed to make it dead in the water, and asked Connor if they still had the position of the command vessel, and Connor said he could extrapolate from last known position, and Hayes pointed out that the formation was broken now with ships spread out searching, and the command ship was isolated even if the Krathiks did not realize it yet. Hayes stood and announced this was it, and they had one shot and ordered Helm to come up at maximum speed right under the command ship where they would hit it with everything and then run like hell for the jump point, and Zekthor found himself speaking and telling Hayes this was suicide, and the captain looked at him with eyes that held absolute unwavering certainty, and explained that in human history they had been facing impossible odds since they climbed down from trees and fought predators with sticks and crossed oceans and wooden boats and split atoms and touched stars, and every time someone said it was impossible, and every time they did it anyway, and this was just another Tuesday for humanity. The Defiant accelerated through the storm, rising toward the Krathiks command ship, like a missile launched from the depths, and alarms shrieked as hull temperature spiked, and the crew worked in focused silence with each person performing their role with practiced precision, and they emerged directly beneath the massive command vessel so close that the 2 ships' shields nearly touched. Hayes commanded them to fire everything, and the Defiant's entire arsenal launched at point-blank range with railgun slugs and missiles, and even the spinal cannon, all directed at a single point on the command ship's belly, where shields were thinnest. And for a moment nothing happened, and then the command ship's core began to cascade with power systems failing in a chain reaction, and the massive vessel went dark, tumbling slowly in space with all systems completely fried. Hayes ordered Helm to the jump point immediately, and the Defiant's engine screamed, pushing the ship beyond rated specifications, and behind them the Krathiks fleet scrambled to respond. But without their command, ship coordination had broken down completely, and some ships gave chase while others tried to aid their flagship, and a few just opened fire randomly hoping to hit something, but none of them followed the Defiant to the jump point, and as the human ship vanished into hyperspace, leaving the enemy fleet in complete disarray, Zekthor sat at his observation station in stunned silence because they had won against impossible odds with no right to victory by any tactical calculation, and Hayes had been right because for humans, this was just another Tuesday. The journey back to Coalition space took 3 days, and Zekthor spent most of that time reviewing his recordings because he watched the battle again and again, trying to analyze every decision and every maneuver, and trying to understand what he had witnessed. But the more he watched, the less sense it made because the humans had violated every principle of sensible warfare and had taken risks that should have resulted in their complete annihilation, and had bet everything on tactics that depended on enemy mistakes and technological failures and pure audacity, and somehow it had all worked. As he dug deeper into the recordings, Zekthor began to notice things he had missed during the heat of battle, like the slight tremor in Connor's hands when the Krathiks fleet first appeared, and the way Lisa's jaw clenched so tight he could see, the muscle jumping, and the momentary silence on the bridge when Hayes ordered them to engage 27 capital ships, and he realized they had been terrified, every single one of them, but they had simply refused to let that fear control them, or stop them from doing what needed to be done. On the second day, Zekthor found himself in the ship's medical bay, ostensibly to review reports of combat injuries, and Lieutenant Commander Holly Grant, who was the chief medical officer, and also Lisa's sister, was treating a young engineer named Peter Shaw, who had suffered radiation burns during their deep atmosphere maneuvers, and the burns looked absolutely agonizing, but Peter only gritted his teeth while Holly applied regenerative gel. Holly told Peter he had done good work down in engineering, and that the captain said the shield modifications Peter implemented had given them an extra 3 minutes in the storm, which probably saved all their lives. And Peter nodded and then noticed Zekthor standing there and asked if the observer was getting good footage of human durability, and Zekthor said he was documenting everything and asked Peter if he had been afraid during the battle. Peter laughed and then winced from pain and said he had been absolutely terrified, and they all had been. And Zekthor asked why they continued if they were so afraid, and why not retreat instead. And Peter looked at him like he had asked why water was wet, and explained that retreating meant leaving the Outer Rim colonies undefended, and the Krathiks would have hit them next, and thousands of civilians would have died, and most of them were human, but some were from other coalition species, too, and they could not let that happen. Zekthor argued that surely coalition forces could have responded eventually, but Holly interrupted and pointed out that by the time coalition forces mobilized, those colonies would be nothing but ash, and the Defiant was there, and was capable, so that made it their responsibility, and Zekthor heard that word responsibility. And he had encountered the term before but was beginning to understand that humans defined it very differently than most species, because for them, it was not about assigned duties or contractual obligations but something much deeper and more personal. That evening, Zekthor found Captain Hayes in the observation deck, staring out at the stars streaming past in hyperspace, and the human looked tired with the adrenaline of battle having faded long ago. And Hayes greeted him without turning and asked if he had finished his analysis, and Zekthor admitted he was uncertain he would ever finish analyzing what he had witnessed, because humans were difficult to understand. Hayes smiled slightly and said, "Humans were difficult for themselves to understand sometimes," and asked what specifically was confusing, and Zekthor's mandibles clicked in frustration as he listed everything, including how human tactics made no logical sense, and they took absurd risks and refused to accept defeat, even when it was mathematically certain, and fought with a ferocity that seemed contrary to their otherwise cooperative nature. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was soft and contemplative, and he explained that on Earth, which was their homeworld, humanity had spent most of its history fighting against nature and against each other and fighting for resources and territory and survival, and they had nearly destroyed themselves dozens of times with nuclear weapons and climate collapse and pandemics, and had come right to the edge of extinction more than once. The captain turned to face Zekthor and continued explaining that humans had learned something in all that struggle, which was that when things got desperate, and when odds were impossible and hope seemed lost, that was when humans were at their most dangerous, not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they simply refused to give up, and would find a way or make one, and would bend the rules or break them if necessary. And if that did not work, they would rewrite the rules entirely. Zekthor asked why humans could not simply accept limitations like other species did, and Hayes shook his head and said that accepting limitations meant accepting that some things were impossible, and if some things were impossible, that meant some people could not be saved, and some wrongs could not be righted, and some futures could not be reached, and humans did not accept that, because they could not, because it was not in their nature. Zekthor thought about the battle and about the crew's willingness to face a fleet that should have killed them all, and about their determination to protect colonies they had never even visited. And he said quietly that this was what the coalition feared about humans, and not their aggression or their weapons, but their absolute refusal to accept the impossible. And Hayes smiled sadly and agreed that was probably true. The captain explained that humans were unpredictable and dangerous and did not fight the way other species fought, and did not think the way they thought, and that made them both valuable and terrifying. And Zekthor pointed out that the coalition would read his report and would see what the humans did and would see how they thought and would be frightened, and Hayes said he knew this would happen. Zekthor asked if that bothered Hayes, and the captain looked out at the stars again and quoted a human general who had said he would rather be feared by enemies and respected by allies than loved by either, and explained that the coalition did not have to love humanity but just had to trust that when impossible odds came, the humans would be there, refusing to back down. Zekthor left the observation deck with much to consider, because he had thought he was documenting a simple military engagement, but instead had witnessed something far more profound, which was a glimpse into the human spirit, and that inexplicable quality that drove them to challenge the unchallengeable and fight the unbeatable. And he understood now why this was both humanity's greatest strength and most dangerous characteristic. On the third day, the Defiant arrived at Coalition Station Omega, which was a massive orbital platform that served as a hub for military operations in the Outer Rim. And as they docked, Zekthor prepared his preliminary report, knowing that what he wrote would influence coalition policy toward humanity for generations to come, and he wrote honestly about everything, including the battle, and the tactics, and the courage, and the fear, and the human capacity for violence, and their unwavering commitment to protecting others, and their dangerous unpredictability, and their reliable honor. Admiral Treshevore, who was his commanding officer, read the report with growing alarm because the four-eyed Sharon military commander had overseen coalition forces for 2 centuries and prided himself on tactical knowledge, and he said flatly that the report could not be accurate because no species would employ such reckless tactics. But Zekthor replied that he had full recordings, and every word was verified. And the admiral said, "Then these humans must be madmen." And Zekthor corrected him and said no, they were simply human, and that was precisely what made them so dangerous. And the admiral stared at him for a long moment before asking if he was recommending they keep humans as allies. And Zekthor responded that he was recommending they never ever make humans their enemies. 3 weeks after the battle in the gas giant's atmosphere, Zekthor stood before the Coalition Strategic Council, which was the governing body that oversaw military operations across 14 sectors and 200 member species, and the chamber was vast with representatives from every major civilization in the known galaxy, and he had prepared a comprehensive briefing with tactical analysis and combat recordings and psychological evaluations and projections of human military capability, and everything the Council would need to make informed decisions about humanity's role in coalition forces. As he looked at the assembled representatives who were all so certain of their understanding of warfare and civilized conduct, Zekthor realized that data would not be enough, because they needed to understand what he had felt standing on that bridge watching humans calmly plan the impossible. And so he began his presentation by saying he had been assigned to observe humanity in combat and had accepted believing it would be routine, but he had been completely wrong. The chamber grew quiet because Zekthor was known for his measured academic approach to observation, and this emotional opening was very unusual for him, and he continued by explaining that for 300 cycles, he had documented warfare across the galaxy and had witnessed the mathematical precision of hive mind fleets and recorded the honor duels of the Kashari and analyzed the siege tactics of the Vorlith Empire. And in all these observations, warfare followed predictable patterns because species fought according to their nature and their technology and their cultural values. But humans did not follow predictable patterns. He activated the holographic display showing the Defiant surrounded by Krathix vessels, and the recording played in compressed time with the Council watching in silence as one small human ship dismantled 8 raiders through tactics that violated every principle of conservative warfare, and then the display shifted to the engagement with the fleet, showing the Defiant's impossible victory, and murmurs rippled through the chamber. Representative Kalmor of the Vraxian Collective called out that this must be an error, because no single vessel could defeat such numbers, but Zekthor replied there was no error, and he had witnessed everything personally and verified every detail. And another representative suggested the Krathix vessels must have been damaged or undermanned, but Zekthor said they were at full combat readiness, and the engagement logs were available for review. Someone else suggested some trick or a weapon they did not know about, but Zekthor interrupted and said the only weapon the humans possessed that the Coalition did not already know about was their willingness to do things that seemed impossible, and he deactivated the hologram and faced the Council directly, and told them they had asked him to assess whether humans could contribute to Coalition military efforts. But that was the wrong question, and the right question was whether the Coalition could afford to have humans as enemies. That statement got their complete attention, and Zekthor explained that he had studied humanity extensively since his observation tour, and their history was a chronicle of conflicts that should have destroyed them because they created weapons, capable of sterilizing their own planet, and came within moments of using them and faced extinction-level events dozens of times. And any rational species would have developed cooperative strategies and conflict avoidance and peaceful coexistence. He continued by pointing out that humans did develop all of those things, but they also kept the capacity for extreme violence and refusal to surrender, and tactical innovation that bordered on insanity, and they were cooperative and aggressive at the same time, and logical and emotional and peaceful and warlike, and they were contradictions that somehow functioned. And Representative Shenva of the Crystalline Union argued that this made them unreliable because unpredictable forces could not be trusted in coordinated military operations. Zekthor said with respect that the representative misunderstood because humans were extremely reliable and would always, without fail, refuse to accept defeat and would always find a way to win even if that way seemed impossible, and would always protect those under their care regardless of cost, and the unpredictability lay not in their commitment, but in their methods. And he pulled up another recording from the Defiance Bridge during the final engagement with the Krathix command ship. He told them to listen to how the humans spoke and let the audio play with Hayes giving calm orders, and the crew responding with focus and complete absence of panic, despite facing certain death. And Zekthor explained they had been terrified because every biometric reading confirmed this, with elevated heart rates and stress hormones flooding their systems, and hands trembling, but they were experiencing the same fear response that any species would feel when facing impossible odds. The difference, he explained, was that they did not let fear stop them, because they felt it and acknowledged it and proceeded anyway. And that was what made humans dangerous, not their weapons or their ships, but their absolute refusal to let reality dictate outcomes. And Admiral Treshivor, representing Coalition Military Command, asked if Zekthor was saying humans were a threat to Coalition stability. Zekthor replied that he was saying humans were what they were, which was a species that survived by being too stubborn to die, and a species that viewed impossible odds as a challenge rather than a deterrent, and a species that would sacrifice everything to protect those they considered under their care. And he pulled up one final image showing the Defiance crew assembled in the hangar bay with 243 humans, many showing injuries from the battle, all looking directly at the camera. He told the council to look at them because they were not warriors by choice, and that young man was an engineer who wanted to design terraforming systems, and that woman was a pilot who dreamed of exploring uncharted systems, and the captain himself had been a colony administrator before the war, and they were ordinary beings thrust into extraordinary circumstances, but when faced with the choice between their own safety and the safety of others, they chose others every time without hesitation. Zekthor said the Coalition must decide whether such beings were allies or threats, but he warned them that humans were already their allies by treaty, and the question was whether they would treat them as valued partners or potential enemies, because if they chose the latter, and showed humans that they feared rather than trusted them, they would create exactly the threat they feared. And someone called out that this sounded like blackmail. He replied that it was not blackmail but simply observation, because humans responded to how they were treated, and if you threatened them, they became dangerous. But if you respected them, they became fiercely loyal, and the choice was theirs. And Representative Calmore stood and asked if Zekthor trusted these humans, and the observer thought of Hayes calmly ordering his ship into impossible danger, and Lisa making sure an observer was safe even during combat, and the crew terrified but determined, refusing to abandon their duty. Zekthor said finally that he trusted them to be human, which meant he trusted them to do whatever they must to protect those they cared about, and if the Coalition earned their loyalty, they would have allies who would never abandon them no matter the cost. But if they earned their enmity, he trailed off and said he prayed they would never learn what humans were truly capable of when they decided to fight. And the council debated for hours after his testimony, with some arguing for restricting human military operations and others advocating for full integration. In the end, they reached a compromise giving human vessels greater autonomy, but requiring coordination training. And Zekthor thought it was exactly the kind of careful, measured response that humans would probably ignore the moment someone needed help. And he was proven right. 3 months later, when the Defiant detected a distress call from a colony under pirate attack outside their assigned sector, and Hayes jumped to the colony and engaged the pirates before backup arrived, saving 4,000 civilians and losing 12 crew members. The council called it a protocol violation, and the families called Hayes a hero, and the crew called it their duty, and Zekthor, reading the reports, called it exactly what he had warned about, which was humans being human, and he updated his report with a new conclusion recommending the Coalition adapt to work with humanity, as they were not as anyone wished them to be because they would break rules and take insane risks and refuse to accept losses, but would also save lives and win impossible battles and inspire others to be braver. And he knew which choice he hoped the council would make because he had seen what humans did when fighting for something, and never wanted to see what they would do if fighting against everything